So, hi everyone. I'm Steve Schreiber. I'm the chair of the architecture department at UMass Amherst, and welcome to the annual David Dillon Memorial Lecture. So this, of course, is a very unusual year, and therefore it's a very unusual format for our lecture, but you can think of it as the David Dillon Memorial Lecture from home. Before I introduce our distinguished speaker, I wanted to say a few words about David. So David lived in Amherst, Massachusetts for many years, although he was the best known as the architecture critic for the Dallas Morning News. He also was the author of a number of important books about architecture and architects. When he was transitioning from the Dallas Morning News, we were able to entice him here at UMass Amherst Department of Architecture to entice him to first join our advisory council and then join our faculty. So during his time on our faculty, he taught a number of courses, including junior year writing, philosophy of architecture and design, research forum, and modern architecture. In addition, he directed a number of independent studios. He was a thesis advisor. He was an active contributor to faculty meetings and retreats, and he generally was very involved in our program. He died way too soon, now 10 years ago. So after he passed away, the Dillon family and a number of his friends, many of whom are on the webinar today, decided to create the David Dillon Memorial Lecture. So this is, I just counted, this is actually the 11th such lecture. So it's really been a great run. So I want to acknowledge, I believe that Sally Dillon and some of her family are here, but unfortunately because of the way that the format of this webinar, we can't introduce you to you in this format, but we thank her and her friends and family so much for continuing to support our department. So coming to us today all the way from Chicago via Zoom is Lee Bay. So I don't know what you can see, but I think what I can see is I can see Lee to my right. But Lee Bay is a member of the Chicago Sun-Times editorial board, where he shapes the newspaper's position on a range of issues, including urban planning, land use, and politics. He's a photographer, writer, consultant, and lecturer whose work deals in the documentation and interpretation of the built environment and the often complex political, social, and racial forces that shape spaces and places. Bay is the author of Southern Exposure, The Overlooked Architecture of Chicago's South Side, a book that showcases his architectural and social commentary and his photography. That book was published last year by the Northwestern University Press. He's an adjunct professor at IIT, where he teaches a class based on the book. The class examines how race shapes architecture and urban planning in Chicago's South Side and other communities of color across the country. His photography has appeared in periodicals and magazines such as the New York Times, Architectural Digest, Chicago Architect, Old House Journal, and many others. He's the former Chicago Sun-Times architecture critic, and his writing and reporting on architecture and urban design have been featured in a number of other publications, including Architect, Chicago Magazine, Architectural Record, the Houston Chronicle, Crain's Chicago Business, WBEZ Chicago Public Radio, Fox News Chicago, Guardian Cities, Monocle Radio, and CBS 2 News Chicago. He also served as a deputy chief of staff for architecture and planning under former Mayor Richard Daley, and he's also a sought-after expert on architecture, architectural history, and the development of cities. He lives in the historic Pullman community of Chicago, which we were just talking about how that appears in various movies, and has 3 adult daughters. So please join me in welcoming Lee Bay.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here this evening, and certainly glad to be here at a lecture in honor of David Dillon. You know, any architecture critic who's honest with himself or herself will admit that I guess stole would be the more honest word, but borrowed is the more charitable word from David's, who I didn't know who I didn't know when I was architecture critic, didn't know personally, but certainly was inspired by his work. The idea that a building and writing about architecture was more than writing about a beauty contest of buildings, but writing about the context of the building and writing about cities. You know, he wrote at a time of growth in Dallas. I was fortunate during my time as architecture critic from 97 to 2001 to write about architecture at a time of growth in Chicago at the time. And it's just a pleasure to be here. So thank you. Thank you. So should I just jump into the lecture, I guess? All right, I will do that. Southern Exposure, the overlooked architecture of Chicago's South Side, you know, as Stephen mentioned, was published last year. And, you know, the route to getting there and some of the images that we're going to show, it's kind of interesting. I mean, I'm a South Sider by birth, and I've lived here for most of my adult life, with the exception of 12 years in Oak Park, the home of Frank Lloyd Wright and his work. And as you know, as a South Sider, you begin to develop oftentimes a kind of a chip on your shoulder that the city makes no bones and folklore makes no bones about the South Side, and to an equal extent the city's West Side as being the other side of the tracks. You know, I years ago, when my now adult daughters were babies, I was up one night watching television, holding the baby and, you know, feeding her. And maybe 20 years ago, and Alfred Hitchcock's Lifeboat came on, right? So I thought, okay, a good Hitchcock movie, I'll check it out. And in it, so you know the plot of this movie, right? So there's 7 or 8 people. They're in a lifeboat in the middle of the Atlantic. The ship that they were on has been blown up by the Nazis, and they all kind of have to get together here. So it's like Love Boat, but with no love. So 2 of the characters are William Bendix and Tallulah Bankhead, and they're kind of sparring with each other. So at one point, Tallulah Bankhead tells William Bendix, "You are a low creature, obviously from the gutter. Thing of it is, I'm from the same gutter." And William Bendix, without missing a beat, says, "South Side?" So as a South Sider, I'm thinking, okay, Hitchcock, you too have to make fun of the South Side. And then later on in the movie, she talks about how this Cartier bracelet around her wrist is her ticket from the gold, from the back of the yards neighborhood, which is a real neighborhood in Chicago at the time, behind the Union Stockyards, working class neighborhood of immigrants and the like. And this Cartier bracelet was her ticket from there to the Gold Coast. And then later on in the movie, she loses the bracelet in the water, and you know, the South Sider made me laugh. But all of that is kind of based on the truth. Well, if not a truth, certainly based on a certain perception that the South Side of Chicago is a place to leave, a place to flee from, a place to avoid. You know, for the past 50 years or more, the South Side has been predominantly African American and some Latino as well. And that still magnifies itself today. The overwhelming news that you hear about the South Side of Chicago is one of crime, is one of violence, is one of disinvestment. And, you know, much of that is true. But what Southern Exposure, my book, seeks to do, is to show that it's also the home, right along with that, of some of the city's best architecture. And it makes a case for preserving these buildings, but also sets in some sort of context the reason why South Side neighborhoods, when they are in distress, the kind of historic racism and economic racism and violence that have been done to these communities, that's not too dissimilar to the kind of racism and economic violence, social violence that have been done to African Americans all over. We see that magnified now, the difficulties of summer, and some of that is becoming is beginning to be understood a lot better, which is good. So hopefully, and the book ends with kind of a call for change. So I don't know. I guess should I just share the screen and kind of get on with the images? Now, let's see. I practiced this, so let's see if I got it right. Okay. All right. So this is obviously the cover of the book. The cover of the book actually has this building is Eros Saarinen's law library at the University of Chicago. And the decision was made by the publisher to place it on the book's cover, really so they can play with the kind of reflected exposure of the title, Southern Exposure, and the reflecting pool that's beneath the building. But this building is in the book because it too, despite being really the only building in Chicago by Eros Saarinen, and it's late in his short career, it even got overlooked in a sense in the documentary that was put together by PBS or aired on PBS about 3 or 4 years ago. And this documentary on Saarinen's work looks at all this stuff, his collegiate work, everything, TWA terminal, the St. Louis Arch, and then somehow it skips over this beautiful building in Chicago from 1959. And the South Sider in me said, well, it got skipped over because it was on the South Side. And in a way, they gave birth to an exhibition for the Chicago Architecture Biennial that happened in 2017. And the exhibition gave birth to the book. So let's kind of jump in. This blurry picture is me and my father. You can guess which one is me riding the toy horse in the Christmas of 1966 or 7. I guess I'm about a year and a half old at this point. And the reason why I'm bringing you this image of my father is because as you read the book, my father played a seminal role, a huge role in turning me on to architecture as a kid. And in a way that the book explains, planting a seed when I was a kid and a teenager that ended up sort of being harvested by kind of a quirk of fate when I became architecture critic for the Sun-Times. My father passed away when I was 15. And one of the last things he did, the book talks about, the book actually opens with this, was that he gives me a tour of his old neighborhood in the city's Bronzeville community, which ends up, oddly enough, being the first thing that I wrote about 15 years later when I became architecture critic for the Sun-Times. But that is my father. Died young too. He was only 52. And I was 52 when I wrote the book. I'm 54 now. And it was kind of interesting that we were the same age. And, as I'm writing it, so it began to, kind of hit you in a different way. This is my mother. My mother's influence, this is the same Christmas, even though they dress me up every Christmas this way, but this is the same Christmas. And through my mother, I get an appreciation for movies and art. These are things that begin to inform my career as well. Now, let's kind of jump into it. One of the buildings that I wanted to show in the book was this building, Pride Cleaners, in the city's Chatham community. If you know Chicago, it's on 79th and St. Lawrence. This building was built in 1959 as a dry cleaners, still is a dry cleaners, despite the board being in the window when I took this photograph. But it's a striking building. It's a hyperbolic paraboloid concrete roof. This, as you all know, the self-supporting roof clears out the need for columns on the inside of the building. So this sort of the space on the inside for all the dry cleaning equipment and the counters and the people, can be managed economically. One of the most interesting buildings in Chicago, you'll see no other building in Chicago like this. And yet, by virtue, in my opinion, the book argues of being on the South Side, not much written about it. No architecture tours, not mentioned in the many books about Chicago architecture. One could easily argue if this building were 70 blocks north or further, closer to the parts of the city that the tourism mechanism, the preservation mechanism, didn't tend to historically write off, it would be seen and known more. Actually, this is the building I wanted for the cover, but I got vetoed because it was boarded up there. Here's another modernist building, and like Pride Cleaners, I should back up and say, Pride Cleaners disrupts this commercial corridor that we're on that was largely built in the 1920s. If you and I were to turn around from this photograph, as the housing to the right indicates, this is a classic neighborhood, classic Chicago neighborhood, built in the teens and 20s. Not much happening in the 40s and 50s until the late 50s, when this building kind of comes roaring onto this spot. Same with Pride Cleaners, which is on Martin Luther King Boulevard in Chicago, a classic boulevard in Chicago, built in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And this building originally was Illinois Service Federal, which was a Black-owned bank that started in the neighborhood. The neighborhood is commonly called Bronzeville now. And by the 1960s, by 1960, 61, the bank had enough assets where they built their own building. And here it is today. What's different from the time I photographed this 2 years ago is that the building is now owned by Ghanaians. It's called GN Bank. And they actually, this little patch is a sign for it, but they ultimately took off and replaced the larger sign with the new name. But just a great building by this outfit out of St. Louis that did these kind of design build projects with banks. And it's interesting, these banks are all over the country, and they often are always a riff on whatever was kind of hot, in modernism at the time. So, they kind of borrowed from Gordon Bunshaft here, or they would borrow from someone else there, and kind of scale it down into this kind of commercial form, neighborhood commercial form. Building is in great condition. The inside looks like where Don Draper would have kept his money in Mad Men, and there's really an asset. Before the pandemic struck, we were trying to work out a way to have a book signing here so people can see the interior of this bank. This is a building from around now almost 9 years ago, the Gary Comer Youth Center at 72nd and Cottage, 72nd and South Chicago Avenue, again on the south side of Chicago. And I included this in a book because I wanted to be able to show people that, in addition to the tons of images of classic architecture, teens and 20s architecture, 50s architecture, that the story doesn't end there, that there's still interesting buildings being built and overlooked oftentimes across the South Side. This building is designed by John Ronan, an architect here in Chicago, one of our kind of emerging generation of architects now, late 40s, early 50s, they're really coming into their own. And it was funded largely by Gary Comer, who many of you may remember was the founder of Land's End, the garment company, outdoor garment company, who was born in this neighborhood in 1930. The neighborhood, like many neighborhoods in Chicago and across urban America, undergoes a racial change in the 50s and 60s. And but Gary Comer never forgot his old neighborhood. He was a white guy from the old days who never forgot his neighborhood, and he helped the schools, and he helped individuals, and he helped organizations in and around the neighborhood. And as he began to die of cancer in the 2000s, earlier in the 2000s, he left this as kind of his last gift to the neighborhood, which is this magnificent community center, which has inside, recording studio, rooftop garden, cafe, an auditorium space. What's interesting about this architecturally is that for decades, community centers, much like a generation of schools in Chicago, if they were in depressed neighborhoods, if they were in neighborhoods where crime was on the uptick or had been on the uptick, they built these buildings to look like prisons. Brick, concrete, bunkers, no windows, very few windows, stern, imposing. And this was an idea to do something different, a collaboration between the architect, the client, and the neighborhood to build something that was really a beacon for the area and not just this kind of hovel that you could go in and play basketball in. What was interesting about this, and what John Ronan, the architect, did very well, is that he did harden the building in ways that the uncomplimentary buildings we're talking about were hardened. I mean, if you look, there's very few windows on the ground level. The glass that you see on the ground level is actually bullet resistant. And the action is kind of lifted up off the ground. But again, rather than responding with a bunker saying, you know, don't come here, don't look by here, don't shoot in here, they give the neighborhood a building that accomplishes those kind of things, that makes the occupants safe, but is really a gem for the neighborhood. And even the times I've photographed this building, I'll meet neighbors who come out and talk about how proud they are of this structure. Stephen mentioned Pullman, my neighborhood where I live. You know, most of it, and we'll see some images from the classic days of Pullman, when it was a company town built for the construction and the workers of the Pullman Palace Car Factory. Pullman is part of a larger collection, a larger area here in the Calumet district that was largely industrial in the late 1800s through the mid 1900s. Steel capital, a steel capital of the nation, all these things. And it begins to go into, you know, decline, and ultimately begins to disappear by the 1980s. An organization here called Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives, headquartered in Pullman, but they do work all over, has really played a role in the past 10 years in bringing back restoring the houses in the northern end of Pullman, which is a landmark district, but not as well kept as the southern end, but also bringing new industry to the area. So this is the Method Soap Factory, a green building that matches the company's sort of outlook, corporate outlook. But look at what it has on an old brown field that was once the home, I think, of Ryerson Steel. And this thing looked like it would stay vacant. It had been vacant since the 80s. It looked like it would be vacant for 40 more years. And the company comes here, there's solar panels, there's wind turbines, as you can see. The inside is this colorful soap factory. It looks like Willy Wonka in a chocolate factory, just without the evil, right? It's a beautiful place. The green space that we see next to us to the right, which extends probably 3 blocks, 2.5 blocks more behind us, is a bioswale designed to capture stormwater on the site and release it there, as opposed to dumping into a sewer. And it's been a bit of a catalyst. There's a community center that's been built nearby, and I think a distribution center that's coming, maybe for Amazon or some other entity that's coming nearby, and is slowly beginning to add life to this once fallow industrial area. Oops, sorry. There it is again, the D'Angelo Law Library, again, by Errol Sarnan at the University of Chicago on the southern end of the campus. Bedford limestone base, this accordion-like glass box above it. Just a great piece of architecture. It's interesting when this picture, this photograph, very large, I think 2 feet by 3 feet, was part of the exhibition, the Southern Exposure exhibition, that was part of the Chicago Architecture Biennial in 2017. It was at the DeSable Museum of African American History, which is 3 blocks west of the University of Chicago. And I would get people in from the university a lot who would come in and ask me, where is this building? And it's like, it's on your campus. It's on the southern end. And maybe if you're not a lawyer, or studying law, you're not going there. But just a historic building. Barack Obama, for instance, taught constitutional law here. Not endangered, like some of the other buildings we've seen, like Pride Cleaners. This building has been restored by the university probably in the last 8 or 10 years and is in use and looks good. I'm not that fond, frankly, to the right of that building that's kind of looming behind it, that's been built probably in the last 5 or 6 years. My publisher and I talked openly about photoshopping that building out just to allow the building, the law library, to stand on its own. I used to joke that with my look, I'd forget the reflection, and the reflection would haunt me and the readers for the next couple of years. We're back at Pride Cleaners again because I wanted to show you this marvelous sign that was built obviously along with the cleaners. electric sign. The owner doesn't turn it on now, but just a beautiful piece. Very rarely, I mean, you think about this building, and again, you get a sense if you look in the distance behind the bus to the right of what 79th Street looks like. And, this commercial thoroughfare, it begins the century, begins the 20s and 30s, as a place that you walk down, you catch a streetcar down by, down it, going 35 miles an hour, 25 miles an hour, a lot slower street. And after the war, World War II, it's a lot faster. Everybody has cars. It's a commercial street. How do you catch the eye? And Southern California kind of had this sense where you could take a building and you could make the building so eye-catching, along with a sign, that it makes the driver pump the brakes. You got to go in, and you provide, parking out front. You also are looking at a building that was built at the dawn of the space age, right? And during the jet age. So the idea of the future was something that we didn't seem so scary then. We want to embrace it in our architecture. And also, to a lesser extent, the idea of getting your clothes cleaned the same day you put them in there was also kind of a new thing. So the architecture begins to reflect the scientific, the futuristic, all that thing begins to be reflected in the architecture. Since I took this photograph, after I took this photograph, a new owner has bought the building, a young guy, African-American, a Caribbean owner. And he has really gotten into the architecture. So he spruced the place up, fixed the window, he's painted it. The last time I saw him about a year ago, he was telling me that he's looking to restore the sign. So I was looking to link him up with people in the city's landmarks department. The building isn't a landmark, but they want to landmark it. I was hooking him up with people in the city's landmarks department to help get him there. Now, this is Chicago Vocational High School. This is the auditorium entrance. Now, Chicago Vocational, and it's hard to kind of get a sense of this, is on 87th Street on the far south side, and it unfurls itself for 2 straight blocks down 87th Street. I was a student here, graduated from here in 1983, and you had 4 minutes. At the time, there were 3,800 students that went here to get from one side of the building, all those blocks to the other side, and you'd get detention if you didn't. I got detention a few times. But what I also noticed was that it's a beautiful building. This is the auditorium entrance on the eastern end of the building, and on the western end of the building, And then, there's this kind of machine age Art Deco facade that extends, again, for 2 blocks to our right, if you will. And then the end piece is a gymnasium that looks just like this. So exactly like this. And so in a school that was designed to teach you how to fix cars and to operate printing presses, like I learned, and other things, the architecture gave some weight to the arts on one end and to athletics on the other. This building, again, built for 4,000 students opened in 1941, only has a fraction of those students now, something like 800. So much of the building is closed off, walled off, and there's a concern that without landmark status to protect it, that the public school system is going to begin to chip away at this fantastic looking building. Here's the gymnasium wing on the other side, and then if you look to the left, you get a sense of what the rest of the school looks like. But I remember going here, going to gym, and you felt like a Roman gladiator walking through those columns, right? I mean, it's just a beautiful, school. Chicago Public Schools are kind of an overlooked rank of architecture in Chicago. And the good thing about Southern Exposure is that we're able to take a look at them. Another piece as we get toward our end here, and I really want to get questions and have a conversation with you, is, again, here's an area of the city that's not seen much. Chicago, built on a grid, relentless almost, right angled, streets crossing at 90-degree angles and all those things. And every once in a while, the city will throw a curve at you. And here's one where north of 79th Street in a working class neighborhood, there is a 2-block long lagoon that runs down the middle of the street going from east to west. And it's the damnedest thing. If you've never seen it, at least once a year, when I was architecture critic, someone would be going down 79th Street, and they would need to turn around, and they would go and they would say, "What is this?" And what this is an area that was once briefly a Chicago suburb, around 8 miles north of downtown, that was built along a natural spring that was kind of capped and maintained to create this 2-block long lagoon in the 1880s. And there's this kind of Victorian era, small scale architecture kind of surrounding it, post-Victorian, 19 teens and 20s. And the area fell into disrepair by the 1950s and stayed that way. When I used to cover crime for the Chicago Sun-Times, when I first got there in 1990, and other places I worked before then, this old City News Bureau of Chicago, it was nothing during the spring thaw, for instance, for them to pull a car, a bunch of tires, even the occasional body out of this thing. The aldermen, the councilmen, the aldermen here, and leaders around here said, this is an asset. And they pressured the Chicago Park District, which owned this land, to restore it. And they restored it 20 years ago. They put the new prairie stone, they replanted the trees. They stocked this with fish, so you can fish there. They aerated they make these fountains to aerate the pool and aerate the lake. And it's really become an asset for the community. If you look real closely at this image, to the right, there's guys gathered by the fence there, to the left, I'm sorry. But if you look to the right, there's a man fishing right there. There you can't swim, the sign tells you that, but the Park District stocks it with a variety of fish. And the neighbors who I've met during my many times here really, really like this. The price for all this was $2 million, which is probably the cost of patching a street in Chicago. But it goes to show what can happen in neighborhoods like this. When you make the investment that's been denied for so long, people respond, and people appreciate and people embrace. Now, this is interesting. This house is by Frank Lloyd Wright. It's on the far south side of Chicago in the West Pullman community. And it's in the book for two reasons. One reason is it's by Frank Lloyd Wright, and it's it's his most southernmost house in Chicago. It's an early Wright, 1900. It was a summer home for an attorney. What's interesting about this house is it has been for sale, had been for sale, for less than $200,000, somewhere in the neighborhood of $175 when I took this photograph, for about 1,000 days, according to Redfin and Zillow. No buyer. The house dropped this year to $145. And this house sits on, it's a house and a stables, stable building that matches the house. It's probably the size of a bungalow that's on the other side of this house. And even at 145, it's been tough to get the deal together. The problem is that the house may be listed for that much, but the banks who provide the financing, because there are foreclosures in the area, and because the housing prices on the south side, particularly the far south side, are so depressed, people are having trouble getting the finance to buy the house and give it the rehab that it needs. So as a result, it sits there. Here's a look inside the house, a modest stairway going upstairs, but that's pretty cool. I mean, I want to pull that carpet up, right? But that's pretty cool. I mean, the stairway there. I want to put a tuxedo on and come down there. But just a great house, and hopefully it finds an owner finally, and financing that can put it together. Very briefly, because I want you guys to talk to me. This is 112th and Champlain in Chicago, in the Pullman neighborhood. Again, one of those great surprises that people tend to overlook in the city, and places that don't find themselves often on architectural tours as often as they used to. These are Market Hall apartments. There are 4 of these buildings. We're in one now. There's one across the street, which you can see behind the bicyclist, and there are 2 more to our right that are unseen. And that remnant of a building that you see by the column there used to be was built during the George Pullman era, when he was building the railroad cars, and this was his self-contained town for the workers and bosses of the railroad car company, which is just 2 blocks behind us to the back of us. This was where fruit and vegetables and things were sold during the Pullman's day. Then after then it became a city neighborhood, and Pullman, the company, had to divest itself of its holdings. And it goes through a few things, including being, I think, a grocery store, a liquor store. It burned up at one time, and then it's been kind of this vacant ruin that's there. What's interesting is that the Ness family, Ness, operated, which owned a bakery on the far south side. These are the parents of Elliot Ness, the famous Untouchable, who grew up in West Pullman, not far from here, just a few blocks from here. And according to lore, during the Pullman strike, the Ness family, again, which had a space here at Market Hall, would give bread and things to the strikers, which is kind of an interesting bit of neighborhood lore. But just a beautiful, look at this. I mean, you would drive down 111th Street, one block, a major street, one block to the north, your whole life without ever turning south and seeing this. But when you do, you see what's there. Solon Beeman, who planned the town and built the town, 1889, I think this is, 1888, just a beautiful set of buildings. Each one of the Market Hall buildings, so 1, 2, 3, 4, is paired. You can see the one in the distance behind the bicyclist, to the north, behind the bicyclist, looking just to the left of the bicyclist, kind of behind the blue car, you see another kind of arched building that's connected. Each Market Hall building kind of gets one of these as a companion. And this beautiful duplex, one family on one side, one family on the other. Again, the work of Solon Beeman, but just, look at the detail, the limestone, the bricks, all there and all beautiful. Again, as we get to the end, architecture story still continues on the south side. One of our biggest stars, as you guys probably know, is Jeannie Gang. Designed Silver Cars in New York, Tower, Aqua Tower here in Chicago, skyscraper even taller, Vista Tower, which is nearing completion now. When Aqua Tower was being completed in 2008 or so, she, on the south side, did this beautiful little community center as part of SOS Children's Village, which is this kind of neighborhood for families that's behind me. You can see it reflected in the glass. And rather than to, design the building much like the kind of neo-traditional brick stuff that's behind us, which is all very fair, she puts together this striking building. You can see the various levels of concrete, and inside those wide stairs, this is for kids, inside those wide stairs where kids can not only run up and down, but they can also play and be taught. But just a pleasant building, right? Again, daycare centers and poorer neighborhoods tend to be like community centers, mini prisons, oftentimes. But here's a different way to get at it. We're a building with light and air and glass. You feel good dropping your kid off here. Jeannie got all the accolades in the world, well-deserved for Aqua Tower. But this one, again, completed at the same time, almost nothing was written about. And she and I have known each other for years. She came to one of my book signings by a surprise before the pandemic, and wanted me to sign this page with the book on it. And she was excited that the building had made the book, and I was excited for it to be there. And again, the story still continues. One of the biggest inequities on the South Side has been the lack of connectivity between South Side neighborhoods, near South Side neighborhoods, just south of downtown, but north of Hyde Park. These African-American neighborhoods, predominantly African-American neighborhoods, that didn't have access to the lake, right? And the few bridges that were there, you wouldn't want to walk across them. They were so dangerous. Years ago, this is just to give you an idea, this bridge replaces a bridge that I used to cross for years to get to the lake. And in 1998, this rickety bridge, not this one, again, this is the replacement bridge. In 1998, there are housing developments that are in the space behind us, right? That the city was demolishing through demolition. They were kicking off our leg of the Hope 6 funding that replaced public housing. And the city called it the Plan for Transformation, transforming Chicago housing. public housing. The idea was to blow up, implode these buildings as a way to kick off the program to replace public housing in Chicago, high rises especially. So I stood on the bridge that this bridge replaces, figuring I would get this great shot of the buildings blowing up. Cop comes up on the bridge. He says, look, he says, I'm sorry, I can't let you stay on the bridge. I'm going to get off of it too. I said, really? He says, because we don't believe that the bridge will withstand the explosion of the buildings. That's how bad these buildings were. This new bridge came along 2 years ago. Is by Corrigan and Clark, and I think EXP, the engineers. But it is 1,400 feet across. It crosses Lakeshore Drive. It crosses about 5 sets of commuter rail tracks. But it's an accessible bridge that links these. It's one of 2 new ones that'll ultimately be 3 or 4 when it's all over with. That finally create the Blair Kamen, who you guys know, wrote extensively about this as the Tribune's architecture critic back in the late 90s, early 2000s, the need to build bridges here to kind of link these areas back to the lakefront the way they should have been years ago, but just an asset to the neighborhood. And with that, I guess I'd like to open the floor to questions and kind of have our discussion and see where it all takes us.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation. So I should explain to everyone how we are going to be doing this. And what we're going to ask you to do, if you'd like to ask a question, we'd like you to raise your hand. So below, I think you look under participants, and at the bottom of that, you'll see a raise hand function. And I will recognize you. You can also use the Q&A function, and I see that we have 2 questions there. So I'm going to start with the ones that have been typed in with those questions. And then if you'd like to either continue with the Q&A, typing in your question, or raising your hand, we will get to as many as possible. So the first question on the Q&A was, who is the architect of the Pride Cleaner?
The architect was a Chicagoan named Gerald Siegert. And what's interesting about Gerald is that there's not much about him, despite this incredible building. He was a modernist, and he did houses on the North Shore, modest but very clever houses. And what's also interesting about Gerald Siegert is that I don't think he went to college. I think he learned architecture from his time at Schurz High School, great high school in North Side Chicago in the 30s. And somehow that was all he needed to become an architect. Interesting thing. There's the son of the guy who built Pride Cleaners. He's not, maybe he's in his late 60s, early 70s, and he has a daughter younger than I am. So he's we're not talking about a guy who's 100 years old. The father passed away, but the son is still around. I run into him on occasion. And the daughter, his daughter, the granddaughter of the guy who built Pride Cleaners, and I have been emailing lately. And she mentioned that the idea was really to build the cleaners that had some kind of visual impact, that the grandfather was prone to the big statement, I think her word was, but just a great building. So thank you for that question.
Next question. In your opinion, what is the relationship between the University of Chicago and its context? Is there any correlation with the separation that Columbia University has with Harlem? Or is there integration? More importantly, what do you think of the responsibility of the prestigious educational institutions to their surroundings? And I might add one more question to that, is maybe you could comment on the Obama Presidential Library, which is proposed to be in that same part of Chicago.
Gladly. The book talks about this a bit, but the University of Chicago has had a historically contentious relationship with the surrounding neighborhood. And, for too many years, it practiced some of the most heinous things that you can imagine to control integration or to prevent integration in the neighborhood. I mean, it was the largest landowner, it still is the largest landowner in Hyde Park, and it enforced restrictive covenants that made it legal, to not sell your house to somebody who's African American. So if you wanted to live in Hyde Park, or even work for the university, in the case of, let's say, Allison Davis, or doctorate or researcher there, you couldn't live in Hyde Park. You had to live in Washington Park, the Black neighborhood that's to the east, to the west of it. Throughout the 60s and 70s, there's been this kind of concern, fear that the university would encroach and move south into Woodlawn, Black neighborhood to the south. And there was a gentleman's agreement hatched that prevented the university for decades until recently from expanding into Woodlawn. So that law library that you saw, the street behind that library, if you will, if we were to jump over the building, would have been 61st Street. They couldn't go any further than that. So the southernmost buildings for years are that building plus Mises School of Social Service to the next to it, and a few others right along Midway Plaisance there. The relationship has been tough. The university has not been a good neighbor. The neighbors who are around there and the neighborhoods surrounding it don't feel like they've been well treated by the university. I worked for the University of Chicago, I guess around 6, 7 years ago, for an initiative called Arts and Public Life, where they, beyond the campus to the west, they bought the university a section of Garfield Boulevard, old buildings that are there, and they put an arts incubator there, and we're really trying to turn it into an arts use. And one of the things that the neighbors didn't like, and were very vocal about, was the university's history. To the presidential library, there's a few, there was a sense that it was good for the presidential library to come to the South Side of Chicago. That it was a better fit, the South Side, than, let's say, Morningside was, or University of Hawaii was, other places that Obama lived. But the decision was made to put it in a park, Jackson Park, a historic park by Olmsted. That part has rubbed people a little bit the wrong way. And also there's been a feeling, there's been a sense that the neighborhood to the neighborhoods close by, South Shore, Woodlawn, predominantly African-American neighborhoods, that there ought to be more protections in the construction. This is a $700 million project in the construction of the library to guarantee jobs and access and other kind of things for the people who live there and were the biggest advocates for it. Incidentally, construction was supposed to end this year. It hasn't even begun yet because of various lawsuits and things over it being in this historic park.
Thank you so much. Next question. Did you take all the photographs in your book?
Every last one, which is fun to do. I mean, to kind of marry the words and the photographs together. But yes, I did.
And the next question is from my colleague, Ayla Aksamia. And she writes, and I quote, "I miss Chicago, my second hometown. I would like to ask about your work for the city during Mayor Daley's time. What were some of the most interesting or challenging projects for the city at that time?"
Well, I guess the statute of limitations has run out of most of the stuff I did. The one project was probably one of the most controversial projects Chicago's had in the past 40 years, I would say. Probably since McCormick Place was built, McCormick Place 1 was built on the lakefront. And that was the Soldier Field renovation project, which was the first project handed to me when I got into the mayor's office. To tell its story as fast as I can, Soldier Field is where the Chicago Bears play. Historic lakefront stadium right there at 18th and the Lake, built 1919, and it was really literally falling apart. The Bears are looking to move. They would say that every year we're going to move someplace else. And the idea was to retrofit the stadium in a way that kept the Bears there and gave the stadium new life. The solution was to put this, it was called the spaceship, the toilet bowl, I mean, all kinds of names, but to insert this new seating bowl, visible, popping up into the confines of the old. It improved the sight lines. It's a far better game to watch there. There's sound systems there. It's a beautiful place, but people are still mad about this new space going inside that. I mean, we got letters about it, it took us 18 months to build it. And I would get letters even after I left the mayor's office. Wherever I was, somebody would find me to complain about this thing. So that was probably the most controversial thing. The plan for transformation was probably the second thing, which was tearing down the high-rise public housing and replacing it with mixed income communities. Design-wise, not much controversy, but in terms of where do the people go? Are enough people being returned to the site, which is a valid question, made that program controversial. So those are two.
Thank you so much. Next question. I loved all the images and stories of these beautiful buildings. Could you talk more about what you hope a greater appreciation and awareness of these places could bring? Do you think that a larger public attention to these overlooked architectural works would have a positive impact on the South and West Side neighborhoods? Is there a danger of increased attention drawing more gentrification? And thank you.
Thank you. Great question. I mean, what the book kind of argues and hopes, and what I feel and what I've talked about is that two things happen. One is that the awareness will bring more landmark, will cause more buildings in the South Side to be landmarked. In Chicago, the landmark designation brings with it not just a plaque, but it all but bars demolition and unsympathetic renovations, which are things that kind of plague many neighborhoods. So the idea was that that we would be able to preserve these buildings, the ones, particularly the better of the buildings that aren't, that are in great shape. The idea would be to preserve these buildings because tourism and land. Let me back up a bit. Because landmarks and tourism are so intertwined in the city. The idea would be by increasing the awareness, particularly clusters of these buildings, you could then begin to help drive tourism there as well. Landmark status is an economic development tool in Chicago as well. Tax breaks, that kind of stuff. But they could help ease the burden of ownership for some of these places. The gentrification issue is interesting. Chicago, like for instance, went to Fort Greene in Brooklyn 10 years ago, 12 years ago, went there 7 years ago. I couldn't believe I was in the same place. Gentrification in Chicago doesn't tend to happen that way, particularly in predominantly Black areas. We have a special brand of craziness here in Chicago, which is white people tend not to live in neighborhoods that are predominantly Black. What has historically happened is neighborhood has bottomed out, it's cleared out through urban renewal or through other means. And once African Americans move away, then whites move in. We see a lot of that, for instance, on the very near South Side, the very near West Side around United Center, which when I entered my adulthood in my 20s, back in the 80s, these were solidly Black areas. And then they empty out, and then now, they are not. So there isn't as much of a danger of gentrification simply because of the kind of unofficial social construct, which is essentially if you live there and you're in the majority, we're just going to wait. Where it's really happening, gentrification is in Latino neighborhoods, Little Village, Pilsen. There, this kind of thing is really, really a real thing.
Thank you so much. And so the questions are coming in quickly, and we have the room rented until a little bit after 5 p.m.
I'll answer fast.
No. So I'm just letting everyone know that we'll probably have to cut off the questions after the ones that have been already entered. So this question is, do you think your book is going to lead to some of these structures, such as the Chicago Vocational High School, being landmarked? With the student's interest in historic preservation, her worst fear is that it will be forgotten. More so, have you seen any heightened interest from the city to work on getting any of these buildings landmarked? And then there's another question that she also asked, which is, what's your opinion that the Roby House is so revered, but the house you mentioned is so undermined and forgotten?
Two great questions. I'm sorry. The book calls out in specifics for Chicago Vocational to be landmarked, and it did spark an effort with some alumni to kind of get the landmark process started. So that at least that's good. I'm finding that more people are seeing this when I give lectures and things. People are kind of going to see CVS, old CVS High School, which is good. Have I seen any heightened interest from the city to get these buildings landmarked? Not yet, but I think it's coming. I think Pride Cleaners is one example where the city had an interest in landmarking it after the book really kind of stepped up kind of an interest. We got a new mayor while I was writing the book, Lori Lightfoot, and who really wants to kind of turn back this kind of inequity that's happening to the South and West sides. And she's looking at old business districts, old shopping districts, old neighborhoods as a way to bring resources to them. So we'll see. What is your opinion of the Roby House? But the house you mentioned. So the Roby House has the benefit of being a superlative right work in Hyde Park, right, which is a neighborhood that's kind of a protected enclave. So it's not as out of sight, out of mind as the house, I forget the guy's name, but the house that we saw on the south side. So the fact that this house is so far south in the city, it's 121 blocks south of downtown. You can imagine that, as opposed to the Roby House, which is only 57 blocks. So that contributes to being out of sight and out of mind for many people.
Can you comment on the construction of Crown Hall as part of the expansion of the core of the city into the south side?
A bit. Mises Crown Hall, part of the linchpin, best building in Mises' redesign of the IIT campus at 35th and State, did a little to bring the core of the city, the downtown, into the south side. But what it really did, at least by my estimation, this and a few other urban planning, large-scale, Le Corbusier-like towers and park, happenings around the near south side, is that what it really did, along with the Dan Ryan Expressway, just west of IIT, is it almost helped wall off downtown and the white neighborhoods that once were west of IIT from the black core of the south side in the 1940s and the 50s. You really can see this when you look at aerial maps, right? Whereas through all kinds of means, it's another discussion, African Americans are herded into the Black Belt, which is the neighborhood that IIT is in. You can see that once that begins to happen, the population gets really thick, heavy. There's fear expressed in newspapers that they're going to come too far south in Hyde Park. They're going to come too far west into Canaryville. They're going to come downtown, heaven forbid. And the city begins to place the expansion of Michael Reese Hospital, IIT, which dedensifies the neighborhoods of African Americans and kind of creates these privately owned entities that almost moat off these areas and contain the Black population into this area even more.
Thank you. And this will be our last question. Could you talk more about the preservation of some of these buildings? Is the Cleaners or the Frank Lloyd Wright House in jeopardy of falling into disrepair?
The Cleaners, I was really concerned about when I wrote the book. And again, as I mentioned, a new owner has bought it in the last year or so, who's really preservation minded. So I'm less concerned about the Cleaners now than I was before. The Wright House I am concerned about still, because again, the gap between what it would take to acquire the house and restore it, or even just to acquire it, the financial gap between that and what you can get a loan for in that neighborhood. The house is in livable condition, but that can change in 10 or 12 years, and 10 or 12 years go by pretty quickly. Very quickly, Sharon Bernard says, what's the title of Mr. Bay's book? It's Southern Exposure, the Overlooked Architecture of Chicago's South Side.
Let me just see if there are any hands up. I do not see any.
All right.
So before we wrap up, and I'd like to thank some of the people that are behind the scenes here, of which there are many. And you out there in webinar land might not be able to see them. But most significantly, Pari Riahi, who has been the organizer of our lecture series for many years, has been a tireless worker and organizer in this new format of presenting our lectures. So thank you very much to Pari. And then also to our front office staff, Julie Sarzinski and Jean Crossman, who are also in attendance and who you also can't see, but play a huge role in putting on these lectures. Faye Thurber, I can see, is here also. So Faye worked with Pari on the helping to organize this fall series. A number of other people that, too many to recognize, but those are the ones that have been the most involved. And of course, the Dillon family, I see that Sally is here and Christopher and Catherine all here. So thank you again so much for their support of the David Dillon Memorial Lecture Series. So with that, my question for you, Lee, is how do we get you out here to Amherst? And I think first we have to get a vaccine, and then, but we'd love to get you out here and continue this conversation.
Same here, same here. Maybe I'll buy an extra thick mask. Don't trust the vaccine. That's just me. That's coming out, that's worked on now, but love to come out.
Yeah. So thank you so much. So please join me in thanking Lee for the wonderful lecture.
Thank you. Thank you. Good to be here.